Edited by William Hannes and Didi Kristen Tatlow, China's Quest for Foreign Technology Beyond Espionage is a collection of new essays on the topic. Today, we've got a big group of authors from that book to talk corporate espionage, academic transfer, and what, if anything, the world should do about it. Didi is a longtime Asia-based journalist currently at the German Council on Foreign Relations and also works with Project Synopsis in Prague. Anna Puglisi spent many years as a U.S. National Counterintelligence Officer in East Asia and is now a senior fellow at CSET. Ryan Fedasik is also at CSET. And last but not least, Andrew Spear, a former USTR official during the Trump administration, now at Strider, a software firm that helps to, quote, enable customers to secure their innovation and compete in a new era of global strategic competition. Welcome to China Talk, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
So first off, Didi, talk a little bit about the origins of this book.
Bill Hannes is a huge expert in this area. He's been working on it for very many years. The area being, of course, technology transfer, China's system of achieving that. And he and a couple of others, Anna Puglisi, James Malvinen, wrote a book in 2013, which published when I was in Beijing, working as a journalist. I was with the Times at that point. And I was just completely stunned at the content of that book. It was really like walking into a dark room and somebody turning on the light. I suddenly kind of figured out what the heck was going on, all the stuff I was seeing around me. Fast forward to about 7 years later, and Bill and I decided to write an update, essentially, to try to recast the issue with so much having taken place between 2013 and 2019 or 2020. And in order to really communicate a sense of everything that had happened in those years and a sense of urgency about what was going on in this sphere. So that's why we decided to write it.
Anna, you were involved in the first book. Am I correct?
Yes, I was. I was one of the co-authors.
Which one do you think was easier to write?
I think neither was easy to write because they both serve a very, very different purpose. The first, Chinese industrial espionage, we really were telling the story in some ways for the very first time. I mean, there had been other works, but we really wanted to provide a comprehensive treatment that was really based in Chinese language materials and be able to tell it, from a multifaceted perspective. The second, China's Quest, is actually, I think, takes this story a step further, and because we have so many authors, it really allows us in this book to do deep dives in ways that we weren't able to do in the first one. A lot has transpired. China has changed, the world has changed, and so to really be able to capture those nuances and also to be able to bring more nuance to the discussions, as we do those deep dives.
Has the source material become more or less accessible, given that on one hand, given that there's been much more scrutiny of this issue in the past 7 or so years?
I think it depends. It depends on the particular area. I don't know if my co-authors would like to comment on that.
I think broadly, we've noticed that the source material disappears after publication pretty rapidly, which is why we've striven to archive everything immediately. A few of the websites, for example, that hosted some of the overseas professional associations we talk about in the book completely disappeared while we were still writing the chapters, which made it difficult to do ongoing research and makes it really difficult if you don't know what you're doing and don't know how to archive and treat sources properly.
Yeah, one thing I would add to that, I think that's right. Sources are going away, but we also see new sources popping up as tactics change because, this is not a static game. Things are changing, and so sources go away, but new sources appear.
Why is there anything online easily searchable about this? Like what is it about the sort of Chinese system that makes doing this sort of research in the open source even possible in the first place?
Well, I mean, a lot of it isn't actually a secret at all. I think that's the key point. In a way, it's protected by the Chinese language, which we haven't paid much attention to forever, really. There are still very, very few Western linguists or from other places out there. And, so one issue is definitely the language. Another issue is that in order to communicate, in order to achieve its goals, the Chinese government also, and the party also needs to connect broadly, connect widely, connect to its overseas people, connect to all its scientists, connect to businesses. And, it publishes a lot of what it's doing. It doesn't, of course, there's a lot of stuff that it doesn't publish. That's very obvious. but it does also publish some of the basic things that really should have told us a long time ago, if you like, what was going on here in terms of the drive to acquire science and technology to grow powerful and strong. And we didn't really take any of it too seriously. But having said that, I think definitely there are all kinds of information that need to be accessed, and what is available in public is very useful and important, but really not the full story.
So speaking of things that have changed in the past 7 years, Anna, what's this idea of a stateless global society, and how does the narrative you guys are telling in this book cut across that idea?
Right. So I think really at its core was the assumption that China would change and acquiesce to the global norms of commerce, of scientific collaboration. And for really many years, the U.S. and Western nations' engagement with China has been really predicated on the certain beliefs of globalization, market economics, transnational labor pools, internet freedom, and really what it takes to be innovative. And, as a result, these discussions of China as a strategic competitor have often been shaped by a bias for some of these key assumptions. And so what we really try to uncover in this, the idea of the myth of the stateless global society, is that, those are all really well and good, except, here we have a growing peer competitor that doesn't play by the same set of rules and really has a very different worldview. And in many cases, these areas, if you look at the way the Chinese government talks about these particular issues, they really do see it as a zero-sum game.
Right. I think it's important to note that the book, just to maybe address one part of it too, really went global, I think. And we had really important chapters, I think, on Japan, on Korea, on Europe, which I think are making a very important step of connecting this problem around the world in ways that people in other parts of the world just simply haven't been aware of until now. And, that's crucial, because we're not going to be able to deal with this issue with the procurement, if you like, and taking of massive amounts of science and technology and intellectual property by the party state in China unless we deal with it globally. Because, it of course, there's certain things that are only available in some places, but one thing we see is that as things tighten up in the US, certainly there's a double down going on in Europe. We're seeing pressure all over the place here. The situation is fairly difficult right now, and it's a very different atmosphere here on this issue than there is in the US, also in other issues like trade.
Sure. So, Anna, I'm curious, the idea of the myth of a stateless global society, 1990 to 2020, I guess, was a pretty remarkable run for the world and for technological advancement. Are you worried at the prospect of sort of losing the belief in kind of what international interaction can bring on these fronts? Are you worried about the downside effects of sort of throwing away that vision whole hog?
Right. So the idea of bringing this to the fore wasn't to throw away that vision whole hog, but really to highlight that it only works if everyone ascribes to the same system and plays by the same rules. And that's not to say that there haven't been incredible gains, and there's true benefit. And in fact, we really double down on our values here in the U.S. with, an open, free society, collaborations that include transparency and reciprocity. But it really is to highlight that globalization hasn't really worked for everyone. You can look at just some of the issues that we have here in the U.S. as far as, areas that have been left behind, the hollowing out of manufacturing and a whole host of other areas that hasn't always been win-win, which is what people have been sold. In fact, we laugh, win-win is China wins twice. But if you layer on top of that, yes, for short term, there are a lot of people that are making money. But in the long term, when we see the lack of transparency, when we see challenges to a fair and open, fair playing field, open markets, which is clear in what's happening, as well as, subsidizing key areas of technology, key industries, including companies, that it really is, do we want to keep that vision of, all of the benefits of what globalization is supposed to bring? Or do we want to have a zero-sum vision of those global interactions? And so it's really important, I think, to examine when different areas are playing by the rules and when they're not, and to shed light on that.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to push back a little bit on Anna on the sort of reduction that all we've gotten out of this is people making money, right? Like, sure, China's subsidizing all of its solar panels, but that means we get more renewable energy. Like, sure, there may be scientists who occasionally exfiltrate R&D to the PRC, but at the same time, there's been an enormous amount of benefit that the U.S. has gotten from having all these wonderful PhDs from the mainland come and work in American labs. So
right. So actually, my comments weren't to say that it all was about making money, but you make a really excellent point about the importance of talent and growing that talent. But by ignoring the fact that the systems are not the same, we really undermine all of those Chinese scientists that wanted to do the right thing, that want to participate in the global norms of science, by pretending, that we aren't dealing with, a more authoritarian society that, has some really clear rules about what is supposed to be shared and what's not.
I think that exactly what Anna is saying, it makes a lot of sense, at least to someone like me. The party extends leverage abroad in ways that are uncomfortable or that are alien to foreign governments, and often obfuscated or masquerading in ways that mimic the kinds of systems that we have embraced over the past 30 years, like you identify, right? The United States and its allies lack like a clear analog for the United Front, but the ability to co-opt institutions that we have traditionally leveraged for gain is part of the issue here. And it's just a challenge to discriminate between organizations that might be government or party organized and those that are legitimate organizations that are serving the interests of the people that comprise them, and primarily for the benefit of the Chinese diaspora.
I think we have to, as the others have said, and Andrew I'm sure would have a lot to say about this too, but we have to bear in mind the systemic differences here, which are extremely significant because they shape really the outcomes of these technologies and how they're used on people, and how they then, shape the picture of who we are as people and what we will become. There's some chance perhaps of shaping this all to the good in open societies where there's free speech, debate, honesty in discussion, in public discussion, and courts where real cases can go through and improve things for the greater good, for humanity, if you like. Then there's a great difference between that kind of a system and a system where these technologies are, deployed in often very hidden and specific ways. I'm not saying that doesn't happen in the so-called West, it does. But again, it's a question of what kinds of society you're trying to shape here, and how much control do people have over their society as it's shaped by technology. So, I don't think that it's really going to work to simply say, well, but, they've, great Chinese PhDs, which is, and there are great Chinese PhDs, no question, some individually wonderful people, but that, they've sort of contributed a great deal, because if they're being manipulated, if they're being kind of managed behind the scenes, if their information, if their technology is being managed behind the scenes and used to particular purposes, then we do have a problem when those purposes are so directly anti-democratic, and that's a political problem, and we have to understand this politically, not just technologically or scientifically. It needs to be an integrated response to all those issues. It needs to be an integrated understanding, and I think that's where people really struggle to understand this problem, and that gives the rise to this whole whataboutism argument. Well, but what about in America? Well, but what about in Australia? Well, but what about here, there, and everywhere? Well, it really depends on the kind of the power structure that's informing things that happen.
So Didi and Ryan, both of you two have done some work looking at this issue from Europe and Germany, and I find this particularly interesting because we've done shows in the past focusing more on the U.S. context. Can you give some color about how European companies, academic institutions, and governments are looking at these issues?
The issue is that European perspectives differ really markedly from those that I'm familiar with in the United States. The Europeans that I've talked to from some firms, some companies, tend to worry more that the United States is kind of overhyping the China threat, that really it's more of an economic pacing problem, but that they're really content to engage in what they see as and believe to be free market competition and let the best battle of ideas win it out. In fact, you can look at, for example, Horizon Europe, which is a great example of this. It co-funds an initiative, China Innovation Funding, which is chock full of information and publicity for European researchers to go do research in China, how to apply for awards from talent programs and other things like this. But the issue is, as Anna said previously, the systems are fundamentally different, right? You've got these vast networks of resources that the party organizes. And the issue is that it's really hard to say this organization is founded and run by the Communist Party only to serve its interests. And this organization is founded by Chinese diaspora members to promote solidarity and provide employment opportunities. Because often, most of the organizations that we're talking about do a little bit of both. But it's really hard to discriminate, and therein lies the problem. I think you need to understand, and I wish that more Europeans would understand, and that's part of the reason we wrote this chapter, that the systems are not the same. You know, we found one organization in France, for example, a professional association nominally trying to help Chinese workers collectivize and defend rights and interests and share information with one another. They had received 19 awards from the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office of the State Council and from various organizations of the United Front Work Department of the Communist Party for their contributions to running talent plans. They had sent numerous delegations to apply for talent spotting competitions to bring talent back to China. And the issue is that it's fundamentally non-competitive, right? A lot of the money that goes into initiatives like that is not directly from the Chinese government, right? The recipients might not even be aware that that is the fact. It's not a check that people receive with Xi's name on it. The issue is that the State Council and the party fund organizations that are government-organized NGOs, gongos, as I think CNAS likes to call them, resources them, and then they make payments to overseas researchers to encourage them to return to China. And so there are these hidden flows that fundamentally make the competition non-competitive.
Just to build on that, both what Anna said previously and then Ryan's point, in Europe, one of the things that we do in this book and just in our normal careers is we're constantly comparing what is being said in Chinese language sources and what is being said in English language sources. And so, Jordan, your question actually kind of fits right into this. Earlier, your question about, isn't there mutual beneficiation from all this cooperation? If you look at what the Chinese are saying, if you look at the government, if you look at what Xi Jinping is saying at Davos, it's the same kind of line. And I think they do that intentionally because they know that that has resonance to Western listeners, to those in Europe, to those in the United States. We all want win-win cooperation. It would be much nicer if we could all just get along and cooperate and there were no sort of geopolitical dimensions to all of this science and technology cooperation. But the reality is, if you go look at what Xi Jinping is saying in Chinese to a non-Davos audience, the message is very different. The message is all about not kind of vaguely defined global science technology cooperation, but how can we extract innovation resources from the West, relocate that back to China to commercialize it, to give us kind of an advantage and increase our comprehensive national power. That's the narrative. And I think a lot of those in Europe and in the United States, the same, we miss that because we're focused on, we hear what we want to hear, and it's coming in English language, we understand it, cooperation, it would just be so much nicer if that's all there was.
It's not just Xi that's doing the double messaging. For a different report that I wrote with Emily Weinstein, who you had on the show, I think a few weeks ago, for CSET, we actually investigated the About Us pages of these professional associations geared for the Chinese diaspora in various countries. And we looked at their About Us pages in English, where they were available, and in Chinese, where they were available. And we found that, in about 40% of cases, the English that was presented on the website differed substantively from the Chinese, like whole paragraphs were altered or missing. And in 19 of the 20 cases where we observed that this had happened, the associations advertised in Chinese that they were transferring technology to China in some way, that they were sending participants to participate in talent recruitment programs, and that information was missing from English language websites. Now, you could speculate as to why that might be the case. There might be some very good reasons. Maybe the web administrators just didn't update the page, but at some level, it seems like there is deliberate deception by groups that are backed formally or informally by the Communist Party.
I first sort of realized, if you like, what was going on in Europe around 2013 when I picked up on a message from Xi Jinping in Moscow to Chinese students. And it's a New Year's message, and of course it's Chinese New Year today, so Happy New Year, everyone. It's a lovely festival, and I've got my spring flowers here in the corner. Because it's not just the things that do and don't get said in which language, it's also about how do people who are trained within a certain political ideological system in a certain language understand things. And, if you've come out of the CCP system, you understand things differently from people in other countries or in other political systems, particularly in democratic systems, which tend to deal in the truth. It's a very different situation in a communist system. Yeah, well, of course, people lie a lot. That's why we have courts, right? That's human nature. You've got to keep things on the straight and narrow. It's always an effort, right? But the point is that you need a system to enable that. If you don't have a system that enables or encourages truth-telling, then you're in a very, very different game. And, China doesn't have a system that enables truth-telling in public. So when you see something about, like how Xi Jinping so-called puts out a letter to the Chinese students in Moscow saying, dear lovely students, you are the morning sun, you are the youth and the hope of the future. Please study hard and think about your parents and think about your ancestral country and think about how to repay it. And people who are politically sensitized, as kids who've come out of this CCP system are, in particular some who are perhaps politically ambitious, they understand immediately what he's saying. He's saying, guys, redouble your efforts, bring that stuff home. We need it. We want to grow our businesses. We don't have the technology. We need the technology. Then literally what happened in 2013 is that Xi Jinping did this, and then a bunch of overseas Chinese students in Berlin reportedly rushed out, wrote a letter, a lot of late night drama, contacted the Chinese embassy in Berlin, and pledged their loyalty to the motherland, or the fatherland, whatever you want to call it. This then greases the wheels for another year of technology, kind of science and technology acquisition and redoubled study, and never forgetting that your first loyalty must always be to China, to the ancestral country, and not to the country where you're studying, living, making friends, perhaps would like to stay, for example. So, assimilation isn't really considered a good thing by the CCP. It wants Chinese people to stay loyal. So I think that's also, it's a question of how this language is understood, even when it is fully said in public. Then that just brings things on, I think, to another level. But also to return to that practical level that Ryan was mentioning about what is and what isn't said. What I see here in Germany, and it's the same in the States, it's the same all over Europe, is lots of falsely registered organizations. So literally the charter of an organization such as the Federation of Chinese Professional Associations in Europe, which is here in Frankfurt, says we are apolitical, we have no views on this, we have no views on that. Now, that's simply not the case. So, there is also deliberate deception going on.
So, coming back to that point that Andrew and Didi made, how do I frame this? Can you really blame them in the sense of there's a way to tell this narrative in another from another perspective, which is that, if I am the president of a developing country, let's say Turkey, let's say Mexico, let's say Argentina, and all of my smartest people are leaving the country and most of them are staying in this other nation and actually forgetting, maybe sending remittances every once in a while, but are really not doing anything to sort of help economic development from the places where they came from. There are other countries that have sort of gotten stuck at the $6,000 to $10,000 GDP per capita level and have never made it out. And if I'm running a system, I'm really focused on that and trying to do everything I can to sort of stop that from happening. So is the difference here a measure of scale, given the context of sort of the broader U.S.-China relationship, the fact that, China can pose a threat to the U.S. in the way that Turkey or Mexico couldn't? What are the differences here that lead to the laser focus on this?
Honestly, Jordan, I do think that from a Chinese government perspective, a lot of this is very, very understandable. And of course, you're going to want to acquire advanced technologies if they exist out in the world. Back to Anna's discussion earlier about the kind of the vision, the ideal of kind of the stateless global society, kind of the implicit in sort of the vision there was, okay, we in the United States and the West, capital intensive advanced technologies. China has labor intensive economy. They will focus on kind of the low end manufacturing. We will do the R&D. It will all be great, kind of mutually beneficial win-win based on comparative advantages. You do kind of have to take a step back and say, well, from a Chinese perspective, are you going to be happy in perpetuity down at the low end of the value chain? And of course, it's quite obvious that they're not. And so, my view is that part of what we're doing, in this book is saying, hey, these things are happening. It to me, it's not totally surprising that they're happening. Now, some of the tactics, some of the specific cases are, egregious, and certainly there's concern because of some characteristics of the political system in China, the authoritarian nature of it. But at just a sort of a human kind of level, I think it's very understandable that China would want to kind of upgrade its industry, rise up the value chain.
Is this more of a pacing issue? Is it that there are non-competitive incentives generated from state-backed policies in China, and that's what we should really be concerned with? Or do you think that there are also incentives for criminal activity or a disproportionate amount of criminal activity, like visa fraud or wire fraud or things like that? Is that really the angle that we should be more concerned with?
I think there are incentives for criminal activity. I think you see that a lot with the talent programs kind of over and over again. And I think we should be concerned with that. I think one of the premises of the book, though, is that a lot of this activity is beyond espionage, right? It's not necessarily illegal espionage or theft. That's the tip of the iceberg, but then there's the huge iceberg down here that's kind of gray zone, extra legal in many cases. And so, I think the point is that it's totally understandable that the objective from the Chinese perspective would be to acquire this advanced technology and move up the value chain. I think we have to look at that eyes wide open and say, of course, they're going to want to acquire these things. And there is this geopolitical dimension to these things. It's not just all about global collaboration and kind of everybody can be happy. There is, in economics, there is kind of this idea of some countries are at the high end, some countries are at the low end, and that's just the way it is based on what your comparative advantage is. So my point is just from that perspective, it's entirely kind of humanly understandable that the Chinese objective would be to move up. Now, all the illegal stuff definitely has to be addressed with. I think the harder stuff to deal with is what we focus on in beyond espionage, which is the gray zone activity. Okay, if something isn't explicitly illegal and yet it's not in the U.S. national interest or in the national interests of European countries, and it is in the interest for the Chinese government to do this, how do you deal with that set of issues? I think that's very difficult.
And I think, I'm just going to add in here, I think it really gets at the larger question of what kind of a system, what kind of a global system do you want? Because we look at some of these policies and they date back decades. And the one that comes to mind, as we talk about, I think in the West, the wonders of we send our students overseas for cultural experiences and to learn more about, immerse themselves in the culture. Chinese students have been sent out with a purpose since the opening. And some of the policies that are, state council policies, and one that strikes me, it comes out in particular, is the whole idea of serve in place. So the whole system around these programs is set up to extract technology and to leverage. It's not about collaborations where there's a win-win, where we're following what we believe as the global norms of science and the global norms of commerce, but ways to kind of undermine that system And it really gets down to what is the vision of the world that you want.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, I mean, as Andrew says, this is sort of understandable and also reflects this much older desire in China to develop and to not be so-called behind or backward. And of course, that is rooted in the experience of having been overrun to a certain extent by some aspects of the West, which is a real one. But I think in this sort of kumbaya, let's share it all sort of globalistic world, you really need to ask, what is the outcome of all of that? And when you see, for example, technology being quietly appropriated in order to do things like, create aircraft launching systems on aircraft carriers, which then could well be deployed in the Taiwan Strait or around the Taiwan Strait, where you have, we all know there's 24 million people in Taiwan and over 80% of them want to have nothing to do with the CCP. That's how high it is, it's probably 90 or more. I'm probably understating it. And then you need to ask, well, what is the purpose? What is the moral point here that we're actually dealing with? And not everything is the same. Democracy didn't exactly come easily in the places where it exists either. It's often very, very hard won and hard maintained. So should somebody really be able to just kind of have all the science and technology and also have full political control and really very substantial abuses at home, thinking here of the Uyghur lands, thinking here of Hong Kong, my own hometown, which has had a state security law come down on it, which is terrifying to people. And there's a lot of stuff happening now. So you need to ask, what is the outcome? What is the impact of this technology transfer? It gets back to a kind of a political moral question, if you like, not just a economic or developmental question.
So Anna, you talked about how Americans send students abroad for cultural, for cultural learning, and the first thing that popped into my mind was this book, Shoal of Time: A History of the Hawaiian Islands by Gavin Davis, which I just finished up a few weeks ago. And I don't think those missionaries were going over for cultural experiences. Maybe the sailors were for their sort of like week-long sojourns, but there's a very long history of Westerners going to other countries around the world, not necessarily with the only trying to study the language and learn the art or what have you. So just to sort of complicate the story a tiny bit, it's not. Anyways, I might just cut that part out. I'm not sure how relevant that is, but it was a really good book.
Yeah, I mean,
I didn't go quite as well as I had it in my head.
I wasn't talking about missionaries or I'm kind of talking about since the 70s, but that's
anyways.
Can I just leap in here on the Hawaiian parallel? Because, here in Germany, there's a very long Orientalist tradition. In fact, this whole notion, the phrase Silk Road, was coined by a German aristocrat in the 19th century, von something or other. What you see here is just for generations of Germans, for example, have really had this romantic relationship with China. Oh, it's about the philosophy. Oh, it's about, Taoism, Buddhism, balance, etc. And these are wonderful, fabulous things. But it's simply not the interest that comes from the other direction. And, that's obviously an example of unbalance in, China has different goals in mind right now. Europe has sort of been there, done that on a lot of this stuff. So it's a complicated debate, but sometimes I think that we're a little bit like, a badminton and a tennis match, that we're not actually playing the same game at all. There's just very different ground rules going on, and that's difficult to handle, and especially in the grey zone, because everyone says, oh, but you're just being mean about, China or Chinese. And, and my own moral compass there is always the people of China themselves, especially those in Hong Kong and Taiwan who can still say stuff and what they think about it all. And I can tell you that what they think about it all is ballistic compared to the stuff that, so-called Westerners say, because we are more concerned about being seen to be offensive. But Taiwan, Hong Kong, they're absolutely, most people, I would say majorities, are absolutely clear about things. And they're very concerned about the immediate political problems and human rights problems and what their children's futures will be like if the CCP, really does manage to parlay this technology transfer into being, the biggest, strongest, most powerful country in the world. they're worried.
So before we start talking about solutions, I want to sort of, this is a podcast, so you guys don't see this, but right now we're on a video chat where there are 5 white people talking about this issue. And the concern that many have when you start getting into these sorts of discussions of how to address technology transfer is that sort of the repercussions and the broad brushstroke potential for law enforcement to address these issues is serious and, can cause really, unfortunate problems in society that I don't think any of us want to see happen when it comes to sort of discrimination and in companies and academic institutions and even in the way people are treated by the law. So thoughts on this, the best way to sort of frame this in a way that doesn't end up leading to the sort of broader stigmatization of anyone, anyone with any sort of China connection?
Well, Jordan, I find it ironic that usually any discussion of the behavior, and that's really, I think, what we have to crystallize, because this is really country agnostic. If we saw, or if there was the same kinds of policies, programs, behaviors taking place from any other place or organization, I think we would have the same reaction. I think it also comes back to some of our comments of the influence piece as well, because we can't ignore that a lot of these groups and in the United Front is one of them, plays on our own identity politics and really trying to make this an issue of ethnicity as opposed to these are central government policies and programs that seek to undermine the global norms of openness, transparency, reciprocity, and also challenges the vision of what kind of a society do we want to live in. We cannot ignore the atrocities and the human rights violations that are going on. So it's much broader than that, because as Dee Dee is saying, is some of the concerns as folks and friends that we all have, the Chinese people deserve better.
I think the fundamental way to minimize the unwarranted discrimination, right? That's the question here, is to get more fidelity and to just cut narrower. And it's very possible, right? You can go and find specific information and do some digging on a case-by-case basis. You have to do it in Chinese, there's no question. But it would certainly be a mistake, for example, to paint with a broad brush and say, we're going to prohibit professional associations specifically for Chinese people in various countries, right? But at the same time, look at the United States. We found probably 30 such organizations in the United States. Every single one of them is registered as a 501c3 organization with tax filings. And yet on the About Us pages of their websites, they talk about how they do consulting work for state-owned enterprises in China, which seems a little bit strange or not necessarily within a 501c3 mission set. And so I think that it's fairly easy to honestly enforce laws that are already on the books in a fairly fair way if you just get more information and understand what's going on in the Chinese language. And there are other examples of this. You can find highly detailed information. We collected and actually found 3,000 people who had received talent awards under the 1,000 Talents program. And it's fairly easy to understand where someone works, where they went to go work or were offered a position, and whether or not that should even be, considered possibly a red flag. Because in a lot of cases, you're right, it might not be, but you've got to do the homework, and law enforcement agencies need better language resources to do that.
So one of the interesting proposals that has been bandied about in the Biden administration, as well as in this book, is the idea of clemency. Can you walk us through that, and what do you think the upsides are for that sort of approach to this issue?
Well, I think this is a tricky issue, very tricky issue, and we did indeed have some debate about it. We've all come from very different backgrounds, where we know different things about different things to different degrees. And I think that the main idea was to really to show good faith in the sense of trying to put information out there so that scholars and scientists who may truly not understand what they're doing, who may truly be embedded in certain social or thought patterns or path dependencies that have led them to innocently get involved in certain groups, structures, friends, old colleagues, whatever, would have the chance to sort of realize actually what the problems are. Because, to be fair, we have been ignoring a lot of this for a long time ourselves, and have maybe not offered the environment in which this information was available to them before, that there would then be an opportunity for them to say, well, honestly, I had no idea about X, Y, Z. And I do have friends here in Europe who are, for example, members of professional medical guilds or biosciences guilds who really, and I know them personally, and they are not, they see the whole thing fairly innocently, and in fact some of them have taken very deliberate steps to walk away from some of the structures. One of them was approached, in fact, by the MSS many years ago to spy for China, and he said no, and I've seen the documentation, and after he said no once when he was a young student, they never approached him again because they don't want someone on board whom they can't rely on. So, but he's in these things for friendship reasons. So I think it's a question of that kind of person, and this gets us back into the grey zone, which is so difficult. So that was really the focus of an idea of clemency. Others, completely correctly, I think, also made the point that a lot of people will abuse that, and that where you can ascertain deliberate and knowing participation or actions, then they need to be justly pursued through fair trials. And I think that was also taken on board. So maybe it behooves us to create a clearer argument or set of facts about what is and what isn't okay. And I think that we have, in a public sense, not done a terribly good job of that in recent decades. I think in the US, you're much sharper on that. Certainly here in Europe, there's a great confusion about what is this thing, the party, what is this group, what they don't even, there's no concept of intentions or actions generally. So, yeah.
I might be able to venture a bit more as someone who's never worked for a government but is from the United States. It seems like clemency can be a good or bad idea depending on your actual policy objective. And there are trade-offs between deterring future crime, gaining transparency and awareness of the scope of the party's operations, punishing past transgressions, and buying public support for future prosecutions for, let's call them like the really bad apples. And clemency helps, especially with the last option I just mentioned and some of the other ones as well. But then it punishes you and prohibits you from punishing behavior that is probably anti-competitive or illegal, and the kind of which like we've been talking about. So there are definite pros and cons, but it really depends on where your country's government is already at and what you want to accomplish with the goal.
So the idea of type 1 versus type 2 errors in this issue set, I guess my concern is that, now that Anna and Andrew are outside of government, and, we haven't hired the 5,000 new linguists yet, until that sort of capability is built up, I'm particularly worried about the type 1 errors. And I feel like, coming back to a values discussion, right? I mean, how many type 2 ones are we willing to have in order to ensure that we don't make any type 1 errors?
I think I understand what you're getting at. My view on that is that, the scale and scope of this system that the CCP, the PRC has set up is enormous. It's multifaceted. It is complicated. There are government initiatives. There are so-called societal, initiatives or aspects to it. There are, private enterprises involved, universities involved. It's very complex. Therefore, the way to address or the way to get at that kind of system from a U.S. perspective or European perspective, I think is going to have to be similarly multifaceted and complex. So I do think government has a role. But we all know that government tends to paint with a broad brush and, kind of bring sledgehammer solutions to issues. I think what we're trying to do at the company I'm at now is take a little bit more of a scalpel approach. And Ryan spoke to this a little bit earlier. The information, the data does exist out there to be very targeted in how we're addressing these issues. I think that has to be a part of the solution as well, a part of the response. I think there are other aspects that need to be a part of the response as well. Universities may take a different approach than private sector companies. which is going to be different than government. And so, I mean, that's kind of how I think about it. And hopefully an approach like that would help to minimize these type 1 errors where, okay, we understand government paints with a broad brush, it brings a sledgehammer, so let's narrow the scope of what it's trying to do. And then, our society in the US and in Western Europe, I think we do tend to, eventually work pretty well in kind of this very complex way where various actors have different roles, responsibilities, and are approaching things and solving things from a different perspective.
I think you really hit the nail on the head with this is a very comprehensive problem. And the kinds of things that our system is up against, it's not designed for that. And I think it really kind of gets back to the point that our systems are very, very different. And the challenge when you have two different systems and you're trying to argue point to point, it often it's very tactical and isn't going to necessarily get you the desired outcome. And so it really requires, stepping back and taking a strategic approach to how do you deal with an inherently different system that undermines the openness and transparency and the processes, that we've just come to assume are the way that everyone does business.
I feel a little bit right now that it would be really nice if China were to take a little more responsibility for what it's doing. I think that it's using a lot of its people to achieve certain national ends, and its language about that is very clear. We see Xi Jinping talking about what overseas Chinese do to further the glory and the strength and the economic social development of the motherland. And then you read in the updated National Defense Law on January 1, 2021, that development interests are now a cause for the use of armed force. And you just kind of go, well, look, this is such a huge, intricate, as Anna just said, comprehensive, interconnected situation and plan with not a master plan, if you like, but so many bits connecting and pushing for similar outcomes that in a sense, people who are trying to simply track it to say, hey, look, this is what it is. I think that we also need to be very clear about sticking to what it is that we're doing. And maybe I say this because of the situation in Europe being really rather different from that in the States right now, or Australia. And it would be really nice if there was sort of, not that there will ever be one, but, if the Chinese government were to actually, for just a little bit, actually kind of tell the truth about what it's actually doing here with people. And some people may not like that comment, but I stick by it. The first victims are always going to be the Chinese people.
It might feel with some policies like certain folks in the administration were or are really taking an axe to this tree, but there are still low-hanging fruits that we can pluck like very easily, right? And I think that's how you avoid massively getting type 1 errors in ways that would not be acceptable or moral. Until December, the United States hadn't added 3 of the 7 sons of national defense, these universities in China that are intimately connected with the defense industry, to the export control entity list. It was a very basic step. It's one that I think makes a lot of sense, in particular from those universities, and yet it hadn't done so. And there are a lot of these low-hanging fruit kinds of policies that have not been enacted in other countries, which is really where it matters. The United States is pretty advanced and or aware of the issues concerning talent recruitment and access to overseas technology by the Chinese government and the Communist Party. The same is not true in Europe, where the threat environment and the threat perceptions are a lot different. And yet it's extremely important that we make this point and that the United States government take the case to allies and partners. Pick a metric, any metric, the number of Chinese students who return to China after graduating, the number who receive scholarships from the China Scholarship Council, the number of professional associations that are transferring technology to China, the number of coercive joint ventures that have been set up with firms. The United States is a plurality of those metrics, but it is not even a majority in many cases. There are European firms, Japanese firms, Korean firms, other firms in other countries that are also suffering the same kind of practices and coercion, and their governments may not be aware of it. It really varies case by case, and that's the point that I think a lot of us were trying to drive home in writing the global scope of this book and drawing on so many voices. Because it's really going to take a team allied effort to address the problem at the systemic level that Anna and Didi are talking about.
Thank you all so much for coming on China Talk.
All right.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much.
Look, 简单如 ABC， 打开我的歌像个 APP， 外号 ACE， 跟你不在一个维度，我们 ACG。圈里太多 ACTOR， 你们输出的只有 COR， 我是 METEOR， 开个说唱艺术展在798，理由发哥们周润发，我的 flow 很炸，让你头很大，左手还跟打死右手分打，我把冰摩卡当瘦身茶，为何我的肚长肉？因为周围太多 rap 让我不享受，发音清楚我不 mumble， 我是 rap god 哥们不 humble， 你的女朋友是洛丽塔，我的女朋友是阿丽塔，印第安比广州火车站批发，4个字形容我唱的 hip hop， 就是汤姆汉克斯、汤姆克鲁斯、马特达姆勒布朗詹姆斯，小人都在死，但是大佬们都让你啊！最近这些 beef 特别新鲜 ，diss 特别贫贱 ，peace 都是明面，为什么你能看得到？我有鹰眼，我不要你的精炼，哥们我要银联。妈，你在屋里放着把屋子里装到的木皮箱。你是抄袭，我是致敬，我们可能长得像，但是不一样。用 wordplay 印钞的男人，擅长做 freestyle 的男生 ，KPI 都是超额完成，将我哥们路放倒个干身，感觉生活像做音乐了，有好的 EQ 才能做个 master， 所以别让他们把你压缩，让我把这世界的时针打破。You should know that don't fuck with us, don't fuck with ABC。我们脾气不太好，抢了书来把的 live house， 他们只能给你 me messed up beyond my G，we do that masterpiece lead。That's my destiny, best of me， 在这比的我跟 A R 和 C， 展示着彩牌子的技术，钻石和白金这种水平，别别的靠近我们，勇士的对手从来不是 T， 不境界你们差得远，不只是演出比你加了点，嘴里喊的都是 real hip hop， 不仅不愿哈子，还每天他家里花你发的钱，没实力的活该吃一辈子屁，对自己不严格就没有办法成为 ACE， 写的每4句就类似你，难怪你配置低，我们的差距像是8KSD ABC， 合作像 Eminem 搭配 Dre Speed，Travis Scott 喊的 Ace Lee， 你是毁灭战士，我是 CSD， 不是刘作峰也能够控制 Place B，Ace Me， 我是你哥哥，自己琢磨一下到底谁是 D， 给你一中指问你 Let's G， 这句 shout out to 误读，每当我嘴臭完刷牙的时候，又 shout out to 杀手，你不得不服输我继承了前辈的活力，我感激，没流下眼泪和啜泣或惋惜，我 24/7 like a Kobe C 的，我并不需要活得弱鸡的满意 ，Real Rig and that's real， rap kid gonna kill， 有必要的活我就 kill Bill，remember ABC we ill， 这组合叫 ABC， 贝雷帽配个黑皮衣，火力堪比 LAPD， 先比个手势 PACE， 再猜个反派压着 CBA， 面前这道菜需要 TT 味，撒点盐我们拉高门槛的目的是为了过滤圈里那些敌敌畏 ，TDK 的标贴在我每个段落有着品质保证，未曾烂过，像 John Rambo 出手必是干货，让外挂猎枣们就地散伙，你模仿的是形式，我做说唱时还会实现实名制，带着至今的心时至今日，你碰的不是钉子是块试金石，论歌词中肯那歌是公认，懂行的都双手合十公分，但在黑的眼里又何止痛恨，缺货们都该做个核磁共振，别阿谀奉承用心评价，那些歌让我 ZZZ， 这行业应该重新定价，需要拉动的不只是 GDP， 再送你个 LOL， 字里 KO 了多少个 KOL， 靠营销的都在学着吹口哨，哥们真材实料，手都会柔道，拿子弹火喷的哥斯拉，无法控制强迫着何时发，因为我像是柯达喷上特斯拉，这区别不止纬度和时差，依旧保持嗅觉灵敏，就事论事，我就是个阴影，收获灵感给你制造瓶颈，想看用 flow 让你秀逗的情景，不是你口中的 OG， 我跟他们不沾边，所以别拿我跟他们相提并论，真能让我吐3天